Thank you, Peter Levine. Thank you, Nancy Thomas. Thank you, Tufts. I'm a graduate of Tufts 2016, so, fresh off, and, glad, thank you. And I'm glad to be back, and what I might have to say is a little bit provocative, but, that's what Peter encouraged me to do. And, hopefully I don't rub anybody too much of the wrong way. So I began with this chart, not because income inequality is the focus of my remarks or the focal point in any way. It isn't, but it is the backdrop of it. And it's the backdrop of it not for any rhetorical reason, but rather because it's the very backdrop of American society right now. I actually have it saved to my Mac desktop so that as I conduct some of the voter research that I do at NYU, I remain constantly mindful of people's struggles. And as the 20-something recent graduate here, I guess I'm supposed to make things a little bit more hip. But I studied campaign finance law, so I wouldn't count on it. But the perspective I do hope to bring is the one of many recent graduates, right? One in which we have one foot in this quote-unquote real world, but it's new enough to you and you're new enough to it, so that it can make you feel like you're on the outside looking in, both a participant and an observer. And that can make things get very meta very quickly. And that's often an unhealthy exercise, right? If any of you are like me and my friends, there are plenty of mornings when you're awakened by an alarm clock and you slap it angrily into snooze, knowing how foolish you were for letting the wine after dinner debate about Hillary and Bernie's civic philosophy stretch past midnight when you knew you had to get up at 7:30 a.m., but you just couldn't help but make your last point, which became your second to last point, which became your third to last point, and fourth, and so on. But often getting a little bit meta, at least for me, can be helpful because it helps us distance ourselves from the blinding bias of the daily grind, the weekly news cycle, the monthly calendar. And thanks to the critical thought of those late night conversations with peers here at Tufts and at NYU, I've been asking myself a lot of questions lately about the connections between form and function, really, right? The idea that two concepts could be inextricably intertwined and intricately connected, but defined separately and purpose independently. And as someone who studies conflict of interest as a concept, I've been asking, is the current form of politics actually effective for its function? Are the people we are putting into public office truly incentivized to act as public servants? And government in and of itself has no inherent value. That's something I think both liberals and libertarians can agree on. It's only when the energy and will of citizens injects a democracy that institutions typically live up to their promises. But right now, as you can tell from the two speakers before me, Americans have very little faith in their government. And actually, I have some, there's a scary chart here, some scary numbers. Gallup found last week that Congress has hit 9% approval, which actually makes it less popular than the British Crown at the time of the American Revolution. So that's where that's at. And in 2014, Congress had an 11% approval rating, but a 96% incumbent re-election rate. Over 91% of the time, the congressional candidate with more money wins the election. In 2014, those who gave more than just $200 in political patronage, which isn't much post-Citizens United, still made up only 0.22% of the population. Studies show what common sense would dictate, that 0.22%, that donor crop that's significant enough to hold sway, has different, often non-representative policy prescriptions and priorities relative to the public in its entirety. But most shockingly, in 2014, a Princeton Northwestern study was published, and that's become further popularized since, revealing that there is no statistically significant correlation, independent correlation, I should say, between public opinion and enacted law. No statistically significant independent correlation between public opinion and enacted law. And for those of you who may think, or for those of us who may not be as hyper-informed out there may think that Citizens United is a cure-all, it's not. The sample data was actually from 1980 to 2002. So, in short, our former political system has failed to function for the great majority of the people. And this may be where it gets a little bit controversial, but if we're to be honest with ourselves, that means the frameworks we've been using to interrogate that system may have been failing as well, as academics and journalists and people that operate at the intersection of those industries. And a government and its people will always be different things, right? To an extent, that's the nature of governance and representation. There are pros and cons to every system, right? Just take a look at the EU yesterday, today. I think the Dow's down about 620 points. Hopefully it's not another Lehman. And so this rising politics of disaffection shouldn't be overblown as a precursor to certain mayhem, but we are, in my eyes, undeniably at a critical moment that can't afford the complacent certainty that the pace of change can just keep chugging along as is. I don't need to cite the jaw-droppingly bad stats concerning poverty, education, affordable health care, and housing, and drug pricing, and bank subsidies, and more and more and more, and so on, because with years of experience in education ahead of me, you all probably know them better than I do. But what I do know is that things are as severe as we say they are, then they befit actions and reporting and lectures that are proportionately just as severe, even if it makes us the odd ones out. What I admire about the people here is that it's a group that has elected communitarianism, it's a tongue twister, over what the author David Foster Wallace called America's self-centered religion of structuring life around wanting, achieving, and displaying, wanting, achieving, and displaying. Throughout the internship and resume building process during school, then the job hunt process, I found that my friends and I were so caught up, so overtaken, and it was almost something unconscious by a cycle of constantly aiming to be socially desirable according to the bourgeoisie standards of an elite that we are either proximate to or a part of. An elite, 3 million or so citizens in a country of 319 million, who undeniably run this country's systems and who, objectively speaking, without question, have absolutely failed the great majority of the people in this country and arguably have broken the promise of the American dream. I mean, look at the chart, right? The working class has lost more than half of their net worth since 1998. So, often in the corridors of high society, right, especially those who are conscientious, we often get into this pattern of kind of verbally self-flagellating, criticizing elite institutions as being unfair arbitrary arbiters of validation and status. Yet, I took a leave of absence for a semester 2 years ago, and I saw and felt how society treats you when you are not connected to a prestigious institution, and I did not like it. I didn't like it, and I scrambled back to Boston as soon as I could, and it was then that I realized how much I loved the validation and the status that Tufts gave me, and how much I wanted to come back to Tufts just based on that alone. And I thought of how dangerous and powerful a feeling that is. How that meant for all my radical ruminations in my classroom that ultimately the people who I wanted to please were people in positions of power. How that meant down the road, if I had to pick between social currency and sticking to my guns, that maybe currency might prevail. Academics at the helm of knowledge centers and writers at the helm of information systems have to be wary of what I would call an inverse relationship between access and accountability. This dynamic is currently at its worst in media. If I had time to get into it, I'd try to list some examples, and I don't. But it can happen at nonprofits, at universities, any place where funding and mission statements are always in a sort of awkward tango. A relationship in which the closer one gets to people and institutions of power in their careers, social circles, and lifestyles, the harder it becomes to truly challenge power on a fundamental level. And power, by its very nature and all of its forms, can never act altruistically, give some of it away. And for me, that's an extension of a social desirability bias, how cultural and policy analysis and academic legwork can lead us to logical but sweeping condemnations of systems or modes of thought, then how because of a desire to be liked by the elite society to which we are proximate or to which we are a part, those condemnations become less sweeping and transform into more nuanced criticisms. Or just as sweeping but delivered quietly, politely, couched within a suggestion, a perhaps. Criticism that is less sweeping because it includes relevant nuance isn't necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. But at what point does finding nuance in a system that is provenly, visibly, deeply dysfunctional, headed by a purported meritocracy, become a cancerous habit that excuses rather than challenges institutions of power? I'm not saying we haven't stood up at all. If anything, the people in this room are the least culpable. But now we may be put in a situation where we may have to stand and stomp our feet because we aren't. Let me put it this way, because aren't we kind of the last stand? After every other part of our democracy has failed, isn't it our job to use whatever megaphones or microphones that we have as unequivocally as we can to announce that things are in very, very bad shape and to point out why? If a disease is spreading through our body politic, it's a responsibility of us to be the right blood cells, or at least the lymph nodes. Now, to conclude, some diagnoses and some prescriptions and recommendations, even if they're popular, may not start out as politically plausible. But the realm of political plausibility has been the space in which we've been operating for a long time, and clearly has been working for most Americans. A self-fulfilling prophecy, by definition, is a supposition that causes itself to become true are the very terms of the prophecy itself, a positive feedback loop between belief and behavior. And as long as the most visible voices in the academy keep feeding our fellow citizens different iterations of the cliche that, well, that's just the way it is, things will likely remain the same. When Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig came to a forum I hosted in fall, he called it the politics of resignation. I agree, and I think we'll have to expand our political imagination beyond the conventional wisdom in order to solve problems that have cancered far beyond the reach of conventional policy prescriptions. Because, to finish, I think while the sort of inharmonious discontent can quickly calcify into apathy that we've seen in Trump and Sanders, there's really no guarantee that America and its wounds can continue to be papered over by the sort of reductive binary debates that we continue to have, that Professor Allen pointed out that we continue to have. And my worry is that those gashes may instead fester, and there's nothing more dangerous than a wounded animal. So there are times in polite society when eventually all talk becomes small, so all changes are radical, and changing our frameworks is the only thing left to do. Thank you.